This is May 11th, 1988. This is Joe Todd. An interview with Mr. Ernest Johnson in Kansas City, Missouri, and you live in Florida?
Inverness, Florida.
Inverness, Florida. Mr. Johnson, where were you born?
Alabama.
What part of Alabama?
A little community known as Dutton, Alabama.
Dutton. And when's your birthday?
26 September 1916.
1916. Okay. And how long do you live in the Dutton area?
Possibly 3 months.
3 months.
I grew up in the Tennessee Valley.
Tennessee Valley. Okay.
About 25 miles from where I was born.
And you go through high school there?
No, I went through the 10th grade there in the valley.
Yeah.
Well, there in Mississippi.
And why did you join the Navy?
Well, the school burned down. Times was hard. And I couldn't see any way to go to college. So my last year in school was working my way on my dairy farm down in Mississippi in order to go to school after the local school burned down. And we lived 25 miles from the nearest high school, and the local school could no longer teach above the 8th grade.
And what year did you join the Navy?
1934,
1934.
October.
That was in the Depression. Why did you join the Navy over the Army or the Marines?
One of our neighbors and one of my uncles had been in the Navy.
And where'd you go for boot camp?
Norfolk, Virginia.
Tell me about boot camp.
Well, let's put it this way. It was rough at the start, but it became a pleasure after I found my way around. Had the usual amount of fun and hard knocks.
What type of training did they?
Well, it was close order drill. It was 13 weeks we had. We learned sailing. Matter of fact, 4 of my friends and I we went out for a ride in a sailboat after the drill instructor had showed us how to sail one of their boats. So we decided to take a ride, and they come after us and we outran them because they could sail better than they could. We had learned to sail, I had, on Tennessee River, and we had a lighter boat and they had a boat full trying to catch us, and we beat them back to the docks.
They do anything to you when they got back?
No, they were amazed that we could sail the whale boat, the old regulation whale boat, better than they could. But then the chief that was their instructor, why, he didn't have any help as experienced, and 3 of us had sailed before.
And how long did boot camp last?
13 weeks for me.
13 weeks. And where were you sent from boot camp?
I was sent to the U.S.S. Henderson, a transport to go to the West Coast, around through the Panama Canal. So we stop over in Guantanamo Bay, Panama Canal, San Diego, and then aboard a receiving ship, which was in San Pedro Bay Harbor.
Is that where you went aboard the Oklahoma?
Then from there to the Oklahoma.
How long did it take to go from Norfolk around to San Pedro?
It took us about 21 days.
Tell me about going through the canal.
Well, to me, that was quite a sight. It was in the spring of the year, February. Down there it was spring, and it was very nice and beautiful. And coming from a cotton growing country, I saw cotton trees where we only had small cotton plants. And I was amazed at how tall cotton would grow. In Cuba, I saw bushes and trees bearing cotton. At that time, Guantanamo Bay was a floral garden. The base was. I saw hibiscus and other plants for the first time, and being interested in flowers and temperate fruits, why, I spent most of my time taking in and taking a few snapshots of those new plants. And I found out the hard way you couldn't send seeds or plants back because I tried it.
And what happened?
They politely told me, Customs did, that that was the wrong thing to do. And so I lost all the postage and everything. They sent it back to me. I tried to mail it.
How large was the Henderson?
The Henderson was about 400 and some feet long, and I believe it was at least 5,000 ton transport.
Okay, now you say transport, what kind
Troop
of
transport
troop
type.
transport?
And they, during World War II, they converted it to the Hope. They made the ship, hospital ship Hope out of it.
Okay.
And they even gave it to that group known as Hope for worldwide treatment of ill throughout the third world countries.
What type of quarters did you have on the Henderson?
We had bunks. It was very good. For us, it was good quarters. Food was good, except, you know, the usual standing in line. And they all of the passengers at that time had work assignments, which is one of the greatest things the service can do, is to keep their passengers and their people waiting transfer busy.
When you first saw the Oklahoma, what'd you think?
Well, I'd seen quite a few movies in boot camp and everything of the battle fleet because they just left. By the time I got to Norfolk, Virginia for boot camp, why, there was 2 or 3 ships there, and it looked good to me. Big ship, and the stories I'd heard, it fit everything. And besides, the Oklahoma was, to me, was one of the more modern ships, which actually it wasn't. We had reciprocating engines and instead of turbines, and but the living quarters were one of the most modern in the Navy at that time. We had bunks instead of hammocks and cots. Every member of the crew was well equipped. We had lockers, bunks, and good living quarters. And they had a feeling among most of the crew, it was very high morale. And for the young group I went aboard with, why, we were very fortunate that we got a ship like the Oklahoma.
Where were your quarters in the ship?
At first, I was on the second deck, and I was in the 6th Division. You see where the garbage chute is?
Yeah.
That was offices there. The executive officers could look out the window and almost see his porthole and see the garbage chute. We were just inboard of that up to right underneath the boats here.
Oh, okay. So you were right
Amidships.
amidship, right in there.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
But then I transferred to the A Division and went almost to the opposite side of the ship. Identical quarters on the opposite side of the ship. I spent about 5 months in the deck force till what we call the autumn firing practice was over. I was a loader on a 5-inch anti-aircraft gun. When the firing practice was over, well, they allowed us to transfer it to the division, the number of the new recruits, you know.
Yeah. In the deck force, do you holystone the deck?
I never did. I was compartment cleaner. Very fortunate as far as holystone the deck went.
Now, what's compartment cleaner? What's that?
Well, we had to scrub the decks and polish them. They were linoleum, Battleship linoleum, which was one of the highest grade linoleums, I believe. Even today, you can't buy a quality any better. And keeps the paintwork scrubbed and things like that.
Okay. Describe your quarters.
They were little more than a passage at that time in the 6th Division, which was the deck force, little more than along a wide passageway. The bunks were lining each side of it, and 3 deep, three high. And I was fortunate I had a middle bunk and good lockers for storing our clothes, and washroom facilities were adequate to good.
What about the food?
The food to Oklahoma was known as a good feeder. Always fed well.
And who was captain at that time?
We had a captain by the name of Van Auken, and he was known as the man with the wire-haired terriers. He had 2 pet terriers that were well known by everybody aboard ship. Well-behaved little dogs, and everywhere the captain went on deck, usually you saw the 2 dogs of his. Of course, we had to keep the decks well scrubbed and everything. The boat deck was our section of the decks to keep clean, because the captain walked all the way around the deck on his regular walking, and he walked the forecastle also. The main deck, why few people could go on the forecastle, or the enlisted men, I mean, just for recreation.
Now, where's that? What part of the ship is that?
Forecastle is up here at the bow.
Okay.
That was right above the officers' quarters, and usually they done their
In
exercise.
this area. Okay.
And we held our morning quarters, or muster, on the boat deck, just right under the boats there. And when we went to A Division first, for about 3 years, I went to the dynamo rooms, we call it. That was a generating plant. And it was school. What we didn't know, we thought we knew everything, but we soon learned that Oklahoma meant school.
Did you ever see the Silver Service on the Oklahoma?
Yes, I did, many times. And it was beautiful.
When was that used?
I think they had visitors. I can remember about twice. I had a friend who was a steward, head steward in the wardroom, and we had several dignitaries in England. It was used, I'm pretty sure, rather sure it was. And then it was used in France, that I know of. I don't believe they used it, to my knowledge, in Sweden when we were there. But I worked on the refrigerators in the officers' mess, and their pantries, and the wardroom refrigerators.
Where was that silver kept?
They had a very special display cabinet, and just between, I would say on the aft side of the main officer's wardroom.
Mm-hmm. And how big was the case?
Well, the case, if I remember correctly, was at least 8 feet long and about 5 feet high. And everybody at one time or another, I believe, that was interested or had an opportunity to see it, because they were very proud of it. And it was kept shined, of course, so that you could possibly shave by any piece of it.
And how many shelves in the case, do you remember?
If I recall, there was 4 shelves in that case. And it had an inscription in there. I tried to remember it by the governor of Oklahoma, who presented at the commissioning, or a committee from Oklahoma. The Oklahoma was built in New York shipyards in Camden, New Jersey.
Yeah. Let me. That's one of the cups from the Silver Service.
They recovered it.
Well, it was taken off the ship in 1940.
Oh, they took it off the year I left.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I didn't know where this was made, but I believe it was made in Charleston, South Carolina, by a specialist who was at that time known throughout the Navy for his fancy. I was trying to look to see if this was his piece. Oh, I do not believe this is his DYW. I don't think that is
Okay,
his.
I think this is made by Gorham Silver.
Yes, this was made in New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, because later I read an article about it, about the silver set, while I was aboard the Oklahoma.
Yeah, we have the entire service in the State Museum. It's on display.
Is it in Oklahoma City?
Oklahoma City.
And I read a story about it, and this, I'm trying to remember whether it was a cruiser U.S.S. Oklahoma City that had theirs made in Charleston or where.
I think the Oklahoma City has a cigar box off the Oklahoma. It's the cigar box that's
Silver cigar box.
Yeah, that's on the Oklahoma City now. You ever polish a silver?
I polished silver many times, not the Oklahoma silver.
Oh, okay. What's your fondest memory of the Oklahoma?
Well, I expect my fondest memory was the time I spent in the air compressors with Joe Banco, Brown, and Scott, W.E. Scott. I've not contacted Joe Banco, in years. 1951 was the last time I saw him or heard of him. And W.E. Scott, in 1985, I went by his home in Utah, suburb of Salt Lake. And he has a touch of Alzheimer's. I thought perhaps I could get him to go to the Reno reunion. But Scott is one of those people who is very tall. He can hold out his arm. I have a snapshot of Scott holding out his arm. My wife's standing underneath his arm. And Scott's son holding out his arm straight, level, right arm. And Scott's standing underneath that. His son is just a little under 7 feet. And Scott is about 6'4", and the son is about a half an inch under 7 feet. And he jogs 26 miles a day, and he had a little dog who jogged with him. They made Ripley's Believe It or Not. Yes.
What were your duties in the compressor?
Well, when I worked in the air compressor room, we furnished compressed air for the what we call the working line, and for the guns. And this working line is for daily pneumatic tools and for blowing tubes in the boilers, and for, as you know, they have to clean the soot out of the tubes every so often, usually at night when the wind's blowing right. And then when the gunnery practice is going on, they use it for expelling gases out of the 5-inch and the 14-inch guns that we had. And then when working on those guns, especially the 5 and 14-inch guns, they use it to do what they call backing it out. They compress the springs to work on and clean all guns recoil, and it forced the guns back so they could polish them and lubricate them. And we furnished high pressure air for that. That's the 5,000 pound air. And the normal working pressure was about, for gas expelling. After each firing, they expelled the gas in the burning rags, that's the bags that would remain in the chambers as the shot was fired. The powder come in false bags, and they would have to take all that burning bag and powder out before they could reload. So what to do, they hit it with high pressure air and blow the barrels. It's one thing you'd hear in practice, and everybody couldn't understand, some of the southern boys real well, says, what's "bore clear" mean? It meant bore clear. They'd have to look through the barrel with the breech open to make sure there was no burning particles, bags or powder in there. During one instance, we had the Fleet Marines from the East Coast come around in 1938 to the West Coast and hold gunnery practice aboard the Pacific Fleet. And these Fleet Marines were land-based, but they put them aboard ship to use those 5-inch 51s that we had, the long barrel broadside guns. We had a casualty. Somebody, some gun crew member, failed to look very careful when you opened the breech. He made quick glance through the powder bags. Then they had a flashback. It landed on burning powder bags, and 6 or 8 Marines were burned by a flash on the Oklahoma because the bore wasn't clear.
I remember one man I talked to, he said that the Mississippi had a turret explode.
Because of the
Because of that, yeah.
bore wasn't clear.
Yeah.
So we were well in the air compressors. We were well connected with the gunnery practice, and procedure was to call the engineering officer on duty and tell him that the gunnery department was holding practice, so we had to run our air compressors. And
where was the air compressors located?
they were about almost directly under the foremast. That's the main air compressor room. On this ship is right even with the almost central control. It was below central control, which is right straight below the bridge. And we were directly under that. And aft of turret number 2.
Okay.
On the starboard side.
How are these turrets numbered? Which is turret number 1?
Turret number 1 is the first one from the bow. Turret 2 is
Okay.
from the sewn back to the stern.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4.
And the broadside guns and the anti-aircraft guns were numbered odd and even.
Why did they? Oh, excuse me. Why did they take the old cage mast off and put the tripod mast on?
These were considered more efficient until a later design come out, and they provided a better balance on the stand too. They were stronger, and the later design come out was what we call the Japanese powder gun, like the Mississippi, New Mexico, and Idaho was went to. See, the Oklahoma, the Nevada, and Arizona were all of this tripod mast.
Tell me about the midshipman cruise of 36.
Well, in March 1936, we left the Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. We had been, some modifications had been made for the midshipman cruise. We were known ahead of time, as usual. And we picked up passengers from San Francisco to San Diego. About 400 passengers to go into the East Coast. We transferred off people who were going to stay on the West Coast. We went around stopping at Guantanamo Bay and picking up, we served as a passenger ship going east. We unloaded in Norfolk and went up the river, Chesapeake Bay, to Annapolis, Maryland. We run aground going up to it. The mud had built up. in the channel, we run aground. We had to wait for the tide to come in. We floated off and went on into Annapolis, anchored off there in June, May, and we had transferred part of our crew, that is the deck force. Most of the deck force, just only a skeleton of the deck force crew was left on board. All the engineers stayed on board. And we picked up midshipmen who performed the duties of the deck force. They stood watches with us in the engineering department. I would expect there is at least 400 midshipmen made special drawings of every pipe, every compartment aboard the ship until they were as familiar with the ship as the draftsman who possibly drew the original designs. That's what a lot of people knock the Annapolis graduates and all that, but when they get through, you can say if you served in the Navy with an Annapolis man, we always had three categories of the commissioned officers in the Navy. You had the Annapolis men, the reserve officers who were known as 90-day wonders. Then you had the Mustangs, as I was, who were known as the 30-day blunders. And the reason for that is that you commission a man from the ranks, he might be a specialist, or possibly a specialist in 2 or 3 lines of work. The Annapolis man, he has a very good basic knowledge of every line of work aboard ship, especially in the management, also the official capacity of that department. Take an engineer and put him up in supply and damage control, and he can do all right in damage control and in supply to a certain extent. Navigation, gunnery, fire control, he's out of his place, which I found out very soon in my career. We took the midshipmen aboard and they served, and I was really amazed at the willingness and eagerness that a lot of them went after the work. We had an idea that they would be afraid to get their hands dirty and would actually, expect to be waited on. We were really pleased the way the midshipmen that we had aboard pitched in on every job they had to do. It was an education for us as well as the midshipmen.
What's the purpose of a midshipman cruise?
To give them on-board training and to see other parts of the world while they're doing it, get them acquainted with what the politics and the how to have good relationships with the crew and foreign people in which they will later come in contact and do business with. I think that they have, 3 cruises during their 4 years. And without a doubt, it's one of the best training parts of their education.
And how long does the cruise last?
3 months.
3 months. And where did you go in the Oklahoma 36?
We went to England first, and France, and then up to Sweden, up to Spitzbergen, cruising, and then back down to Sweden. And then we were recalled, got down to France. They took our midshipmen off to Oklahoma and put them back on the New York and the Arkansas, which was on the cruise with us, not the New York, excuse me, Arkansas and the Wyoming. They were the East Coast Fleet at that time, the backbone of it. And they give us our deck force back, transferred them back aboard the Oklahoma. We were sent down to Spain, Santana, Balboa, and then over to Vigo, Spain. Vigo, Portugal. We pick up passengers, that is refugees, that was fighting in 2 or 3 towns there on the Bay of Biscay. And then we were sent round to the Mediterranean. We stopped in Gibraltar and unloaded passengers, refugees, and we went to up to Valencia, Barcelona, which were strongholds at that time of the lawless, as they were known. And Franco's people there hadn't taken the Mediterranean coast. The Basques made a strong play for independence upon the northern coast of Spain, but Franco was too powerful. And we had people, and that is Navy representatives with the embassy in Madrid. So we sent extra radiomen and clerical help to the embassy in Madrid, and for a while we had the ambassador of Spain on board the Oklahoma. The seas were rough, and the only way they couldn't dare bring the people alongside on the regular gangway, so that someone in the command devised the idea of using the seaplane hoist at the stern of the ship to put people in the sea bags and let them stand up in it and hoist them on board. And this friend of mine, who was machinist mate second class, Haskell Neal, he had 8mm movie camera, and he got movies. So when Pathé News and every news film company at that time, Fox News, sent representatives out there, and we had aboard for a while a gentleman, one-eyed war correspondent. I don't remember his name. I should, because I knew him. He met most of the people on the Oklahoma, and he was killed down in Ethiopia in the fighting with Mussolini's occupation of Ethiopia. And Lieutenant Carson, and at that time his lieutenant, Robert Carson, and his wife, Joe Carson, were at the University of Madrid. Before that, going to the university, he'd been the M Division officer on the U.S.S. Oklahoma. Today he is a retired Admiral Carson. I was in the M Division under Lieutenant Carson at the time of his transfer. And he's well liked by the crew, and of course some people referred to him in the division as Professor Carson. He was well educated and known for his language abilities. And of course, he carried on as a career as a professor of languages in Loyola University in New Orleans.
And you picked him up as a refugee?
We picked Lieutenant Carson, and he kissed the deck of the Oklahoma, and his wife says, to this day will tell you that was the proudest moment for them to see the Oklahoma and the United States flag flying out there and in their life. And today, we received a letter 2 weeks ago from Admiral Carson and his wife telling us they'd be unable to make this reunion.
They live in New Orleans?
They live in New Orleans. If you wish the address, I have the address.
I have the I have the questionnaire back that he sent.
Oh, that's good. Yes, he told us that he had sent. We sent him a copy of this questionnaire, and he said he'd already received one from you.
Um, how long did it take to pick up those refugees, and where did you take the refugees?
We took them to France, 2 different ports in France, and we were there from in July and then till September, and 2 months, and then we were relieved by the Raleigh and 4 destroyers or 3 destroyers. While we were there, an incident happened that a lot of people probably never knew. We were shot at the Majocco Islands in the Mediterranean. We were fired on by a Spanish plane. It actually hit the Oklahoma. And it was amazing to us. We had no reason to be under fire, but they mistook us evidently for some other ship, because they fired with machine guns. We didn't return the fire because to us it was very incidental, like a wasp after an elephant. Then another incident that it was a little hard for us to understand. You know, we were listening to the radio. At that time we had a Coast Guard ship over, a seaplane tender by the name of U.S.S. Erie, and we were laying out to sea, and we were monitoring Erie's conversation with the Spanish ships. They had 2 or 3 Spanish ships were threatening the little seaplane tender Erie, and they were talking very strong, and about you know, they wouldn't let them come in or operate in those waters. So the Erie captain was very brave, and which reminded me of a later incident too. And everybody says the captain had orders. The ambassador at that time to Spain was aboard the Oklahoma. We took our orders. He says, go over there. We've got to get the people out of that port. We come around the point of land which concealed us from the Spanish ships and the Erie. The Spanish cruiser and destroyer fled to scene. They didn't know, which is what the Erie knew, that they had was the big brother of the Erie waiting around the corner. The reason I say it was a similar incident, at 1941, we were off Martinique patrolling about the mouth of the harbor in Martinique. The French had, Free French had their aircraft carrier down there, and 2 cruisers and about 4 destroyers. They'd sent to America for 400 planes, which they'd paid for, and we were shipping to them under the lease. They got down to Martinique, and France fell. Well, the orders were they would stay there. In order to keep the people there in March and April, to not let these planes fall in the hands of the Germans, we quarantined them. The Americans said that was this side of the neutrality zone. They were quarantined. I was aboard that time of the U.S.S. Charles F. Hughes, which is just a 1,600-ton class destroyer. We had left at Port of St. Thomas. There was only 2 or 3 other destroyers were in sight in the harbor. The French were very anxious to get out and go back to France, and they threatened us. And our commanding officer at that time, he was very brave, talked back to them. To keep things public, well, they had, this was all on the voice public address system. We thought, gee, the captain is very brave. That's one little destroyer and all of those French ships in there, aircraft carrying and cruisers. We'd have our hands full stopping them. Later that evening or the next day, we went back to St. Thomas. we understood why the captain could talk tough and brave. We saw 3 battleships, an aircraft carrier, and about 50 modern destroyers in port.
Was one of them the Oklahoma?
No, sir. That was when the Mississippi and the Idaho and the New Mexico were transferred to the before Pearl Harbor to the Atlantic for escort duty.
After you dropped the refugees off, where'd the Oklahoma go?
From the Oklahoma, we'd go to another port where there was a gathering of British, French, and American refugees to be transferred, to be gotten out. We went to the Mediterranean port of Malaga, and that was a naval base, a small one. And we were laying off some 2 miles offshore. And when we could, we had recreation like swimming. They sound swimming call, you know. They sounded swimming call, but in the meantime, we saw a Spanish submarine come out. They had 3 prisoners chained or tied to the railing of the submarine on deck. They dived. Later they come up and untied the bodies of these prisoners, pushed them overboard. Well, that stopped our taste for swimming. Swimming call was canceled. But that was actually the way they executed some of their prisoners. And that was one of the closest scenes we saw of their action of brutality and so on.
How long did the Oklahoma pick up refugees? How many weeks or?
I would say about 7 weeks
7 weeks.
we were there.
And from there, where'd the Oklahoma go?
We steamed from Gibraltar to Norfolk, Virginia. We got to Norfolk, Virginia in September, and we went into the Portsmouth Navy Yard. They re-gunned the Oklahoma with special long barrel 14-inch guns. We had a hurricane while we was there. The streets and sidewalks of Norfolk and Portsmouth floated. I'd never seen pavement float before because they were wooden blocks. You step on it and go knee deep. You thought it was pavement. They come up, floated up perfect. There's the old wooden block street, sidewalks, and pavement. Made it back in the early days when they used wood. We went up to, from Portsmouth, we went up to Dahlgren, Virginia. We served as a special testing ship for long barrel, heavy charge ammunition testing. The gun factory in Washington, D.C. shipyard had sent these special guns down there to be fired out of turret number 4 and turret number 1. And we fired over 10 days. We laid there and fired. And they would measure the stretching of the lining of these gun barrels each day after firing. They'd take their micrometers, and as the guns were fired, this lining would unwind and the rifling would stretch this barrel. And that was a forerunner of the World War II rifling. And then we went back to Portsmouth. They put our regular guns back in the turrets. We headed east for the west for the rejoin the fleet in the Pacific.
Someone mentioned that one of the refugees had a baby on the Oklahoma.
Yes, I didn't know too much about it, but I heard about it.
Where were you on December 7th?
I was on a mine sweep in Lewes, Delaware, right off of Cape May. We were sweeping mines for the entrance to the Delaware River. I was on a small mine sweep.
Had the river been mined?
Yes, we got 9 mines Saturday and Sunday.
Who mined it?
Germans. We got swept up 9 mines.
We were still neutral then. Why were they mining our rivers?
They knew what was going to happen before we did. The entrance to New York, you know, it was closed for 3 days, one period in early part of World War II with mines.
When you heard the Oklahoma had been sunk.
It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when we got the message word. We went to the shipyard to change some gear. We had damaged some of our sweep gear. We went to Philadelphia shipyard.
When you heard the Oklahoma had been sunk, what was your reaction?
Well, it was kind of rough. And as the news went on the radio about it rolling over, and of course, you know, I knew possibly 300 or 400 people aboard the Oklahoma at that time. Although I'd been gone about 14 months or better from the Oklahoma.
Whenever anyone mentions the U.S.S. Oklahoma, what do you think of?
Well, it's like losing a home. And then your folks and some of your folks with it. Because only looking at a photograph of it, why, I could tell you stories about parts of it that you wouldn't say, well, that shouldn't mean anything to anyone. But every part of it had a story with it. Something that had happened and went on that way. This Joe Banco was an innocent little, what do you call that, Mr. Tweedy guy, you know, the little character, meek, quiet character. He was a little Jewish fellow. He was bald-headed.
Walter Mitty type?
Yeah, Walter Mitty type. And he only had a ring of hair around his head. And you know, discipline was pretty rough on haircuts back in the early, well, let's say until the war was well along. Joe Banco was a peeled onion, in other words. He went ashore every night that he could when he was in port, his first class. He went out after he had 8 years service, but he got in line, the Liberty line for him for inspection, for the officer deck to inspect him before they went ashore. We had a new officer on board, a Lieutenant Bailey. At that time, he was 5th Division officer. And very tough. Well, tough officers are fine. It's regulation, you know. Once the crew understands him, that's it. So he says, uncover, just so we can inspect her hair. He uncovered, and the first man in line was Joe Banco. And before he said uncovered, though, he says, you, first class, 2 hash marks. I'm going to make an example out of you. You need a haircut in the worst way. So step forward. He says, uncover. And the light was so bright, he couldn't open his mouth for several moments. And everybody in the crew knew Joe Banco was a baldy, except Mr. Bailey. He opened his mouth twice, then he says, everybody party in the boat. He knew he would never live it down in the wardroom to pick on the one man aboard ship that didn't have any hair for a haircut. And Joe Banco was mess captain in A Division, and we had a little red-headed boy from Oklahoma. And Joe was regulation and square. As far as that went, he was decent. This boy was kind of a kid, cut up, and Joe disciplined him for a couple of things. And the kid couldn't get back at him in any way except one. He had some of his friends to cut his hair, perfect match to Joe Banco. And every time Joe would look at him, the other people would say, good morning, Joe Jr. And they couldn't have hurt Joe's feelings if you'd hit him in the face any worse than that. Bartow was the...
Well, I think we have a good interview. Anything else about the Oklahoma?
I better quit now while I'm ahead.
Okay. Sir, thank you.
You're welcome.